Hi, I'll be getting the Ready Talk screen up shortly.
Hey,
Hello.
you can hear me?
I can hear you. Can everybody hear?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Just one moment for me to get the Sorry, I was having technical difficulties this morning. But I will be up and ready in just a moment. Okay, the system's almost up. Sorry for the delay, everyone. Okay. Okay, welcome everyone to the October CureGN Study Coordinator Call, Town Hall. So I'd like to introduce some housekeeping. So this Town Hall is being recorded. If you're not speaking, please mute your phone. And the recording will be available on the study website by the end of the month. We have Andy Bombeck, who is an investigator from Columbia. On the phone with us today, he's also a co-chair for the R&R committee with Dana Risk, and she presented yesterday. So Andy, I will go ahead and turn this over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Sorry, apologies in advance for my voice. But we wanted to really thank you for the opportunity to speak at the town hall this month, because both Dana and I, as representatives of the entire R&R committee, really wanted to make sure that we conveyed to really the frontline CureGN staff, which is you, how important a role we are placing on retention in CureGN. So, first years of CureGN, we did a fairly remarkable job enrolling this incredibly unique cohort of patients, and with the shift now to CureGN 2.0, there will be still some recruitment efforts, but we feel that the most important effort at this point is retaining these patients to ensure that we get the best science out of them, make sure that we keep this study as the premier natural history study of glomerular disease. So we're going to talk about the importance of retention and what has worked in other studies, what might work in CureGN based on some of those examples. We're going to focus on some of the unique challenges for the CureGN population, and then I'm going to talk about a quality improvement approach that has been initiated to try to improve our retention outcome. Next slide, please. So, retaining patients is hard in any large study. Just so you sort of get an idea, if you look at our retention rate for CureGN, if you look at our most conservative definition of retention rate, meaning who has been lost and withdrawn from the study. For the first 5 years of CureGN, that percentage was about 12%. And if you look across a bunch of cohort studies, and this is a meta-analysis looking at 143 studies with subject ranges that go all the way up to about 9,000 subjects, but an average of about 3,500, so not that different from the 2,400 of CureGN. Their retention rate was on average about 74% over about 5 years. So to some degree we're doing better than what the average study does. But we're going to show some data in the coming slides that show that our performance is probably not as good as that percentage of 12% suggests. But if you just go by the most conservative definition, we're doing better than, I'm sorry, can you go back? You can sort of see that it's hard to retain. So only about 3 out of every 4 patients in a study at 5 years is still in the study. So that's the challenge that faces pretty much any study, and that's something that we want to sort of keep in mind. But clearly, we want to do better than just 75%. And in this meta-analysis, they looked at a couple of things that seemed to work, and the 2 things that really sort of stood out. One was alternate methods of data collection, which was the idea of instead of having to have patients come in face-to-face, you could do some of the collection over the phone, and that improved the retention rate up to 86%. And then also having what's called a locator document, which is essentially the idea that if we can't find you, we need multiple ways to find you, whether it's spouses, whether it's parents, whether it's your work, a way to make sure that we don't lose someone simply because we can't get in touch with them. And that got the retention rate up to 91%. And what was interesting was that when they looked at sort of themes for strategies that helped, what they called barrier reduction strategies, basically making it easier for patients to be in the study, was the best way to improve retention. And some of the more sort of flashy follow-up strategies like giving cash incentives or using email reminders were less effective. The most important thing in these studies was just making it easy for patients to be able to do the study requirements. So next slide. And then this is a study where they looked at a number of cohort studies. They had to at least have over 200 participants, but they also had to be able to retain at greater than 80%. And the idea here is they're looking at high-performing retention studies. And they wanted to see what are the sort of common themes in these studies. And the key findings, and the number one finding actually came down to the research staff, which is essentially the study coordinators. They needed to be specialized, organized, persistent, and good communicators. So I would tell you at Columbia, and I'm sure this is at other sites as well, our best weapon or our best resource for retention is our coordinators. Our coordinators are the ones who keep the patients involved, who keep them coming back, who make sure we don't lose them, and I think that's going to apply across the consortium. But the idea is that the coordinators who work with patients directly have to be somewhat flexible and do what they call personal touches to try to tailor the retention strategy to individuals. So if a patient says, the only time I can do this is early in the morning, trying to cater to that. And then the other thing that emerges is that a lot of the things that work aren't necessarily in the protocol. So the protocol or the manual procedures may not have all the retention strategies that end up being most important. So, for example, they talk about a study where every patient had to do a fasting blood draw at one of their visits, and the coordinators decided that they were going to have like a cookie or a donut right after the blood draw. And that's obviously not in their manual procedures, but they found that the patients really responded to that, and just that implementation improved the retention. The next slide. So if you look at how we're doing as a consortium, as I said, if you just take the most conservative definition of retention, which is what those studies did in the previous slides, it would be just patients that have been withdrawn. And so our percentage is around, as I said, about 12%. So of the 2,300 that have been enrolled, about 250 have been withdrawn. Next slide. So I have my percentage off by 1, so 11% withdrawals. And if we look at the reason why these patients are being withdrawn, a number of them are lost to follow-up, and that's actually the number one reason. And then there are a few that are participant choice. And then actually the other reasons, when we adjudicate them, it's mostly some version of loss to follow-up. So most of the patients that we're losing, it's not because the patients don't want to do the study, it's because we're losing them. Next slide. And what we did around about 6 months ago is we tried to figure out if there were consortium-wide reasons for these patients being lost or if they were site-specific. So each PCC was given its overall numbers and in terms of how many patients were being lost and how many and what the reasons for why these patients were being withdrawn. And then for each site, they were given the metrics. So the idea is, like, for example, we're using here Penn as the PCC. Of their 623, they had 14 patients withdrawn, and you can see the reasons for the withdrawal. But then it's different by each site. So Mayo Clinic, for example, was outperforming the consortium as a whole, and so the efforts for retention there are obviously working, and really that site, all they needed was sort of a pat on the back and say, keep doing the good work. Whereas this pediatric center on Long Island actually was having a very high withdrawal rate, and it looked like most of it was participant choice or investigator discretion. So the Penn PCC had to go to those investigators and saying, what's going on? What are the reasons why these patients aren't doing this? Is there something that is making it hard for them to do the study? So we did try to make this very granular and very site-specific in terms of trying to figure out why some of these patients were being lost. Next slide. But one of the things that emerged as we were looking at this data was that our 11% rate was probably going to be an understatement of what the withdrawal rate was headed towards. Because if you look at visit compliance, this is, patients actually coming in for their study visits across all of the sites, it appeared to be dropping as the study progressed from year 1 to year 2 to year 3. So patients very eager to come in and do all their visits in the first year, but that starts to drop off as you get to year 2 and year 3. Next slide. And we looked for some signals to say were there populations where this was a particular problem, and it looked like the biggest group that we were seeing in terms of race and ethnicity, where we were losing patients to these in-person visits, were African Americans and Latino patients. So populations that we had done a very good job of targeting for recruitment, we weren't necessarily holding on to them and retaining them to the same degree as we had recruited them. Next slide. And this sort of drop-off was not unique to any consortium. It was an issue across all 4 consortiums. Next slide. And again, using this metric of coming in for at least 1 annual visit is, we think, an important harbinger of somebody being lost to follow, because if they're not making that yearly visit, they seem headed towards dropping off. So it's similar data as I showed you before, and again highlighting that one of the populations that we're particularly worried about is Latinos and African Americans. Next slide. So as CureGN 1 was concluding, what we could say is that we had met most of our recruitment targets. We had reached recruitment goals for 2 of our diseases, and we're approaching recruitment goals for minimal change, and memberness was bringing up the rear, but doing pretty well for a rare disease. We had 11% loss to follow-up, but there was a much higher percentage of non-compliance with the protocol visits. And the groups that were having the hardest problem complying with protocol visits were young patients, African American patients, and Latino patients. And again, this non-compliance with protocol visits, we think, is sort of the warning sign or the gateway towards actually being lost to follow-up. So we think those patients we would call at high risk for being lost. Next slide. So we know that retention is always a challenge. We know that just across pretty much all cohort studies, about 75% retention is considered a very good retention rate, but we clearly need to be doing better, and the challenges are going to be more and more pronounced as our studies get longer. Remember, that 75% retention across the cohorts that was seen in meta-analyses was at an average of 4.5 years. We're already into our 7th year of CureGN at this point, so retention always drops off as the studies go longer and longer. Hence, the challenge is going to be more and more of an effort. Next slide. So as we started to plan for CureGN 2, and in part this was informed by a number of recruitment and retention conference calls, a number of patient advisory council calls with their input, and then some input from the face-to-face meeting at NIH. There were a number of different strategies that we said could be used to improve retention, whether they were focused on better communication, better dissemination of our study materials, reducing the burden for patients, engaging patients more in study involvement, improving our ability to contact patients. So a multi-pronged approach towards improving retention that we did from the planning stages. Next slide. But what we also wanted to do, and this is a metric that we now have disseminated every week, is actually be much more transparent with all of the study teams, whether it's the PIs, whether it's the co-investigators, whether it's the study coordinators, that we're actually not doing as well as we think. So the new metric now actually gives us 3 different ways of looking at retention, and then sums them all up. So if you look at this table here, the second column that says withdrawals, that's what we used to say was our loss to follow-up rate, or conversely, what our retention rate. So as of August 5th, for example, we would say we have a 13% loss to follow-up rate, or for 13% withdrawal rate, and we're retaining at 87%, which, again, 87% sounds fantastic. But if you look to the patients who have been identified as lost to follow-up, meaning they've missed 3 of their most consecutive visits, but have yet to be withdrawn, clearly a high-risk group, have not formally been withdrawn but appear ready to be formally withdrawn, that's an additional 6%. And then another high-risk group, meaning that they've missed 2 visits, is another 4%. So instead of being at 13%, we're actually at 24% if you combine all of that, meaning that at that sort of estimate, we're only retaining 76% rather than 87%, and that's a major difference. So we feel like these 3 measurements actually combined give a much more realistic assessment of where we are with our retention. That 13%, as I alluded to earlier, which is a very conservative definition, patients who have been formally withdrawn, is probably understating just how much loss to follow-up we are seeing, and probably overstating what we're doing as retention. And in fact, we're probably looking closer at a 76, 77% retention rate that we do want to improve. Next slide. And if you look at our performance over the first 8 months of the year, the withdrawal rate has gone up slightly. That loss to follow-up without formal withdrawal has gone up. So we're talking about the last 3 rows here. The withdrawals have gone up from 11 to 13%. The loss to follow-up without formal withdrawal, so again, missing 3 consecutive visits, has doubled from 3 to 6%, and high risk for follow-up has risen from 3 to 4%. So the trends, unfortunately, are not in the right direction. We're not only withdrawing more patients, so our conservative definition has already gone up, but these high-risk patients now are up to 10%, and those percentages have risen from 6% to 10%. Next slide. And as we did with withdrawals, we also decided to look for subpopulations within CureGN that were being overrepresented in the loss to follow-up or the high risk being lost to follow-up. And again, we saw signals that African Americans were particularly making up not only the withdrawals but the high risk group. So 18% withdrawn compared to the consortium average of 13%, and 15% at being high risk for being withdrawn compared to the consortium average of 10%. So if you put all that together, 1 out of every 3 African American participants in CureGN appears headed to be lost. And that is not a good metric that we want to have for our study. Next slide. And a similar percentage for the Latino patients. So 32% either have been withdrawn or at high risk for being withdrawn. So again, 1 out of 3. So just think again, you do a great job creating a study, you do a great job recruiting minority and underrepresented populations, and then you're only retaining 1 out of every 3 patients. It's something that we have to do better at. Next slide. And when we look at age, the groups that are having the biggest issues with withdrawals, but also being at high risk for loss to follow-up because they're missing their study visits, clearly is the younger patients. And this is not surprising, and nor is it surprising that the older patients are doing better. Younger patients have the least flexibility with their schedule, whether it's because of school activities or job activities. These patients really need our help making the study more flexible for them so they can do the study visits. Whereas if you have someone who's retirement age, they can come in whenever you ask them for the most part. But the young patients are the ones who really have the least flexibility, and not surprisingly, we're seeing the worst retention in that population. Next slide. So with all of that dismal data, and I'm joking about it being dismal, but it is important for us to recognize that we're not doing as well as we thought. When we presented our retention rates to the OSMB and the external advisory panel, we said we're retaining at a rate of 87%, and that sounded great, at 6 years. But in truth of the matter, we're really on the verge of retaining only at the rate of 76%. So we need to improve this, and we've decided to approach this from a quality improvement perspective. And so a team has been organized, composed of investigators, study coordinators, and DCC representatives, and with each of the PCCs being well represented. And the idea here is, can we fix these numbers? Next slide. So what we did was we started out by just creating an aim. And the aim is ambitious, but it's important. And the aim here is to increase our overall retention rate to 90% using the CureGN monthly retention data by reducing our loss to follow-up from 6% back to 3%, by reducing our high risk for loss to follow-up from 4% back to 2%, and reducing our withdrawals from 13% to 5%. So very, very ambitious numbers. And we've actually set ourselves a timeline to do this in 6 months and then see if we can sustain that for 12 months. And the goal would then be to be the highest retention rate for any multi-center clinical cohort study. So it's a very well quantified aim. It's also an extremely ambitious aim, but we do feel like we need to set the bar high in order to try to do something important for this study. Next slide. The next step, once you've given yourself an aim, is to look at what drivers have been affecting our retention rate. And so that has mostly been the work of the Recruitment and Retention Committee. And once we get these drivers well identified, then we start to think about interventions, mostly developed by the QI team, but with some input from the Recruitment and Retention Committee, to try to modify these drivers, which in turn will actually help us achieve those aims. Next slide. So if we look again at our retention rate, we see that it is declining, and we want to get this right back up to 90%. So what we really have to do is not only stop a trend, but also reverse a trend. Next slide. And this is just that same aim that we saw on the previous slide of 90% as our overall retention rate. Next slide. So here are the drivers that we recently discussed on our QI call, and these drivers are now going to be sort of evaluated and adjudicated on tomorrow's recruitment and retention committee. And if this is something that really is whetting your appetite, if you're listening to this and saying, I really feel like I have strong ideas about this, even if you're not a member of the recruitment and retention committee, you can join the recruitment and retention committee today and come on to tomorrow's call, because we do want to hear from everyone, particularly coordinators who might have the best ideas about what is causing our declining retention and what could potentially fix it. But some of the drivers that we identified were that patients aren't getting sufficient feedback about their contributions to the study. Patients don't see why or remember why they are participating. They're not receiving their regular care at their study site, so it's actually a second visit on top of their regular care. This is particularly an issue as patients start to transition or move. The nephrologists who are taking care of the patients are not involved in the study, so they're not reinforcing participation. The research site and the research investigators may not be sufficiently engaged with the patient. Probably one of the biggest things is turnover. And I know some of this is unavoidable, but if you're a participant in a study and you've had, for example, Jennifer as your main study coordinator, and then all of a sudden Jennifer leaves and now she's handing you on to Scott, you don't have that same investment with Scott as you had with Jennifer, and perhaps you're going to be lost because you just don't feel that personal connection. Patients who are doing well, so especially with diseases like minimal change or even IgA, where you can have fantastic clinical outcomes, they don't really feel like motivated to continue to participate in the study because maybe they're not seeing their doctor anymore, and they've been told, you graduated out of nephrology care. Moving patients clearly are going to be hard to keep in studies. And then burdens, whether it's the time burden of being in a research study or the financial burden of being in a research study. These are things that we clearly need to address for our patients, because that with reduction in patient burden in all of the analyses of retention is the key driver to getting patients to stay in studies. Next slide. Okay, so that's all I had to present from our standpoint, and I believe, Melissa or Emily, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we were going to sort of open this up to conversation at this point.
Yes. So does anyone have anything that they would like to comment, questions that they would like to provide? I know yesterday we asked if anybody had any retention practices that they've put into play that have been very effective for them.
I just have a quick question. Will these slides be sent to us via email as well?
They'll be available on the study website.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I can start. I can tell you at Columbia, probably our biggest strength in terms of retention, as I mentioned earlier, was our study coordinators, but particularly the diversity of our staff. So, we have a fair amount of Latino patients that we obviously need to do a better job of retaining across the consortium. And one of the ways that we feel like we've done a good job retaining our Latino subjects is that we have Spanish-speaking coordinators. Something that both our OSNB and our EAP have really stressed is trying to make sure that our study coordinator staff is as diverse as possible. Now, that may not be feasible at some places, but that's a strategy that clearly works. So if you are involved in training or recruiting new coordinators, that's something to keep in mind. And the the diversity of a staff can also be reflected not just in languages spoken, but also in race. It can be affected in age. It can be affected in gender as well. We want to make sure that our study coordinators are reflections of our study population.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Does anyone else have anything that they would like to comment on?
This is Barb from the University of Wisconsin, and I just had basically, I guess, a concern with a couple of my patients that are in remission who live long distances, or I have one that's very young and doesn't want the blood draws, so I've been doing, phone contacts, but they haven't been in to have blood draws in a while. And I guess my biggest concern is when the new consent came out to do the extension for year 5 and year 6, I'm getting to that point where they're finishing their year 4, and I don't have the ability in person to have them sign the consent to continue to year 5 and year 6. And I think that's going to be the same problem when we go into CureGN 2. So is there an ability to send them the consent and have them sign them and say they still will let me call them? Or at that point, do I have to say, if you're not coming in, then you're going to have to, you're withdrawing from the study?
That is an excellent question. As far as for those for year 5 and 6, you would definitely need to check with your IRB to see if they allow you to send them the consent form, or even possibly do a phone consent.
Okay.
Yep. For Cure 2, because we'll all be under the same IRB, we'll need to check with that IRB and see if they have any restrictions on that as well.
Okay. Because my understanding is from past phone things that that CureGN 2 may be a completely different study, and we'll have to roll these patients into CureGN 2, or is it going to be an extension of CureGN 1?
It's an extension of CureGN 1. There are going to be changes to the visit schedule just to give more flexibility, and then the biosamples. We're going to end up having one kit for any return visits instead of having a year 1 and then return visits. It's going to be one.
That's nice.
Yes.
Yes.
Melissa?
Yes.
Since it's a new protocol, though, won't that be considered a new study? It would be at our institution.
Oh, it would at yours. Okay. So
I think it's going to be different site by site because it's. I think you can potentially submit it as an updated protocol.
right. So again, because we're going to a single IRB for Cure 2 for the NIH, so we'll all be falling under the same IRB. Everyone will need to be reconsented, of course, because it is different. It's not the same, and because of the time lengths that are put in the protocol or in the consent forms. So everyone will need to be reconsented. Generally, the way we're doing it is, it's just a continuation because we never actually stopped Cure 1 before we went into Cure 2.
So if we're using a local IRB, it's going to be a new protocol because we're not be using our IRB. Is that correct?
It's a revised protocol.
Right, but we're not going to be putting it through to our, is that what you're saying? We're not, it's all going to be under one IRB?
Yes, we're all going to be under ENI.
So in other words, then we'll have to end it, the protocol here at our site through our IRB.
Yes.
So it will, for us, be a new protocol.
Yes.
You'll likely change your IRB to one that's under a reliance agreement. So it may be, again, that you can still use the same IRB and IRB number, but it'll be now under a reliance agreement that gets signed.
Okay. Okay. So everybody has to sign a new consent. Will that be able to be done over the phone? Or sent and returned? Or otherwise I am going to lose several people.
Nope, and that makes sense. So Emily Herreshoff, who is through U of M, is the one that is handling the IRB and all the regulatory. So I will check with her to see about doing phone consent.
Thank you.
So, yeah, so as she's working on getting this done, I will ask her about that, because that would definitely be an advantage. So basically,
right. I have another question about this. I think we're kind of what we're all thinking about. This is Teresa from Milwaukee. So then patients then will be effectively discontinued in our CureGN 1 protocol. I get that it's kind of an amendment, but since the IRB will be different, we'll have to discontinue them and then re-enroll them in 2. So somehow we have to close out 1.
Right. So basically what will happen, as far as to my knowledge, this is what's going to happen. I haven't heard anything different. Is that you'll still have them on the schedule. Their schedules will continue in link. And then basically what will happen is, though, once the year or CureGN 2 goes into effect, their next visit you would need to consent them to say, okay,
right.
We're in the second phase. Just explain like anything that's changed, like the visit schedule is going to change a little bit, as well as the biosamples, and you would just reconsent them.
I think we're all kind of a little more kind of curious about how it's going to work with the IRB in terms of closing out, discontinuing, showing that the data is kind of transferring to this other protocol/protocol amendment that's under this reliance agreement. We will have to terminate, close out CureGN 1 with our IRB, which means we'd have to withdraw all those patients and then re-enroll them in 2, because they wouldn't be followed under 1 anymore, because that IRB then won't have any oversight.
Yeah. So
okay.
Check with this is my best suggestion for you guys. Check with your IRB, your local IRBs, and ask them how they want you to proceed to do
Sure.
that. Okay? And so basically what will happen is once Emily gets everything uploaded for the DCC into the Smart IRB, which we're using, your contacts through your site's Smart IRB contacts will be notified that that E&I is going to be the new SIRB, and that a reliance agreement is going to be requested. So, and then once those get put in place, then you guys will be able to contact E&I and do your submission, which Emily should provide you with any documents that you need to do that. So E&I will, yes, it'll be considered a new study at E&I because we've been under the U of M IRB for the DCC, but they know it's a continuing study. So as far as you don't need it, for our concern, you don't have to withdraw participants, then re-enroll them in link. So you just need to reconsent them when they come in for their first visit once Cure 2 starts. And then I'm hoping that there will be a way that you can mark in link that you've reconsented them for Cure 2.
Yeah, I think seems like it's going to be pretty seamless from like the patient standpoint and link. I think it's just a little unique in terms of how it's going to work with the IRB, because the IRB is going to want to know what we're doing with these patients and kind of closing them out or whatever. And sorry, what was the timeline, do you think, for like getting local contacts and things like that to start that? Is that like Q1 of next year?
So here, I'm going to give you, this is a tentative timeline. Nothing is definite as far as dates yet, due to the fact that we still don't have the finalized protocol. We're in the process of finalizing it right now, and I'm hoping it'll be finalized by the end of this week so that we can send it on to the steering committee for their approval. So then submitting to the SIRB, we won't be able to actually submit the protocol until it's been approved by the DSMB, or OSMB, sorry. And that meeting is going to be held on December 3rd. So then I'm hoping by December 4th we have an approval that we can go ahead and submit to the Smart IRB and submit to the SIRB, which we can do coincide together. And then once we've submitted, then the sites will be able to submit. Okay. And then we're also working on the CRF review. Currently the DCC is doing their second review, and then we'll send it back out to the PI and ST work groups so that they can do their final review. And we're also working on the MOP the study coordinator work group is doing their initial review and making changes, and then once the protocol is finalized, they'll be able to finish those changes and then send it on to a secondary review. Okay, so like I said, these are tentative dates, but just to give you an idea of like what we're working on and what our next steps are. Okay, did that answer your guys' questions, or do you still have other questions?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. And we will, I will try to keep everybody updated as to like what our progress is. And
Melissa, this is Karina. I have a comment on a couple of slides back when Andy was talking about the suggestions for this one. The turnover in key research personnel, specifically with coordinators.
Yeah.
So when he was going through that, I'm wondering if we can develop some type of coordinator transition checklist or guide that would help facilitate introducing a new coordinator and the study when there's a coordinator transition. So a lot of our sites, as you know, have had multiple coordinator turnovers. Some of those have been a coordinator has gone and it's been weeks or months before a new coordinator has been hired. And so maybe if there was some type of information packet that the new coordinator could have in their hand to, in a more congenial, friendly way, say, hey, here's who I am, you know, getting to know you type of thing so that the family could get to know this new coordinator, help facilitating that process. That might, you know, be something that we can give out to all the coordinators to help them when they're making that transition to meeting these new families when a previous coordinator hasn't had time to introduce because they were already gone or they only had a 2-week window and then they were gone, something like that.
Right. Oh, definitely. I think that is a wonderful idea. So yeah, we can definitely work on doing that, pulling that together. And so any suggestions that you or anyone else has about what would be helpful for a new coordinator, go ahead and send that in, and we will work on developing that. That's a great idea. Thank you, Karina.
Can I go back to something? I forget. I apologize. The coordinator from Wisconsin, I don't know your name, but I think it's a really important point that you mentioned about patients who you're able to stay in touch with remotely. So we don't want to discount that, and we actually want you to keep that up. And you know, there's different tiers of retention, and that's clearly far superior than not being able to track the patient. But we use this phrase on some of our retention calls. We call it like touches. We like, you know, how every time you touch the patient, there's like it keeps them retained. And so we do think that these remote visits are still touches. So even if the patients aren't coming in, do not discount all of these remote visits. They are really important for us. There's data collection we still do, even on these remote visits where we're not getting biosamples. That's still very important to us. And so do not. So even if the only way you can keep a patient in your study is through these remote visits, we want you to keep doing that. Obviously, if they can come in and give a biosample, that's sort of the goal. But if they can't, we don't want you to feel like you have to withdraw them.
Correct, Andy. And I know in the revised protocol for Care 2, it does mention in there about remote visits only. Unfortunately, I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly what the language is, but they do mention that now. So to open that up for the sites that do have that issue.
So Melissa, if that were the case, and I think the phrase is a waiver type of thing for just doing remote visits. If that were the case and she was going to do remote-only visits for those subjects, would the fact that she's not collecting samples be a hit against her in the metrics, or would the waiver override that?
I believe the waiver would override that. So,
Okay.
And I'm not sure how many people are aware that we are working on updating Link as well. It may not be ready as soon as we start Cure 2, but at some point, I would say in the first half of next year, we'll have it. And we're looking at being able to mark whether it is a remote-only visit, or so that you're not getting counted against for not having biosamples, because for remote, you're not able to get biosamples. I know that they were also looking at a way to get remote biosamples. I'm not sure how far that has gone yet. I don't remember seeing anything about that in the new protocol. So, but that may be something in the future.
So with this waiver, are you asking them, the patient, to sign the waiver, or,
no.
or?
So basically, and like I said, I don't remember exactly how it's phrased in there, because I know that they had been talking about a couple different ways to get this. So if you have a participant who is not able to come in because they live too far, they moved
right.
and they're not near another Cure site, and they're just not able to come in once a year.
Right.
Yep. So you will be allowed to do remote-only visits for these types of people, and or participants. I don't know if how it is specific, like what the qualifications are. But they had talked about like maybe allowing like up to 10% of participants at each site, but that would gets a little hard to determine, especially when you have very few participants. Another one was that you would just contact the DCC and say, hey, I have this participant, and then we would give you the waiver for that. Once the protocol is finalized and we get it out to the steering committee, then you'll be able to see exactly. And I don't have a copy of it with me to tell you exactly what it says right now.
Okay, that's fine. I guess my biggest concern is, how can I follow a patient who hasn't signed a consent to saying that they want to do that, or, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can explain over the phone, but if they have to sign something, then it's not going to be done in person, and that's what I need to know, if that's going to be a possibility.
Okay. I will check with Emily on that as the regulatory person. So do we need signature for? Okay. I will check with Emily, and we will get that information out for you. Exactly what was needed. Okay. Is there any other questions, comments? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for participating. Sorry we got started a little late this morning. If you do have any questions, or if you have any suggestions on what retention works for you, you can go ahead and email your lead PCC coordinator, and then they will forward it on to me, and I can get it to the R&R committee. So, yeah, just let us know if you have any questions or need anything. And we thank you for participating, and thank you, Andy, for presenting today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.